Hello everyone. The next case I will be narrating for you today took place in South Korea in 1997. It is a case of a random murder, meaning the perpetrator and the victim had no prior acquaintance or grudges. The culprit attacked the victim indiscriminately. The entire process of this case can be described as a convoluted story that spanned over 20 years, garnering widespread attention in South Korean society. This is because two suspects related to the case were present at the scene, but accused each other of the crime. It was not until 2017 that the Supreme Court of South Korea delivered the final verdict on this case. This case is known as the infamous Itaewon murder. In Yongsan District, Seoul, South Korea, there is a famous commercial area named Itaewon, located near the Yongsan base of the U.S. Army stationed in South Korea. Since the 1950s, many U.S. military personnel have favored visiting this place. Over time, more and more people have been drawn to Itaewon for entertainment. Currently, Itaewon has become one of the largest tourist attractions in Seoul, where you can eat, play, and entertain yourself, as well as a very famous commercial area. In 2022, a tragic stampede occurred during a crowded event, resulting in 153 deaths. Today's story took place on Thursday, April 3, 1997. That evening, a 22-year-old college student named Jo Jong-pil and his girlfriend were shopping near Itaewon. Jo Jong-pil was a student at Hongik University in Seoul. His father was a taxi driver, and he lived in an ordinary family that was not wealthy. Nevertheless, he studied very hard and was a stellar student with excellent character and academic performance. At around 10 p.m. that night, he and his girlfriend went to Itaewon to shop. Suddenly, Jo Jong-pil needed to use the restroom. Looking around, he saw a Burger King restaurant at the intersection, which must have a restroom inside. So, he told his girlfriend, "Wait for me outside, I'll be right back after using the restroom." At that moment, there were about 20 youths having a party in the restaurant. Most of them were family members of U.S. soldiers stationed in South Korea, appearing like a group of social delinquents. They were all having a good time in the restaurant. One of them was Arthur Patterson, 17 years old, who had dual heritage, American and Korean. He was fiddling with a folding knife, and people present were quite impressed with that folding knife. They even had a lively discussion about it. Another man in the crowd named Edward Lee, 18 years old, was a Korean American. He was the son of an American soldier stationed in South Korea. In the middle of the party, Patterson and Edward suddenly stood up and went to the restroom together. At that time, Jo Jong-pil, who wanted to use the restroom, had already gone inside. The three of them did not know each other and had no enmity. However, for some unknown reason, one of the two stabbed Jo Jong-pil from behind in the restroom. Unprepared, Jo Jong-pil fell into a pool of blood within seconds. Realizing the disaster they had caused, both fled quickly. According to a restaurant employee, who was the first to discover the crime scene, when he pushed the restroom door open, he was met with a strong smell of blood. He then found a man lying in a pool of blood. Terrified, he ran outside and called the police. Upon receiving the report, South Korean police quickly arrived at the scene. However, by then, Jo Jong-pil had lost too much blood and died. The crime scene had also been compromised due to many store employees coming and going. After inspecting the scene, the South Korean police could not collect much valuable evidence, only knowing that 2 suspects had fled. Since the victim's girlfriend was also present at the scene, she was too scared, but she confirmed the victim's identity immediately. After a forensic examination, it was determined that he had been stabbed a total of 9 times, including 3 times on the right side of the neck, 4 times on the left side of the neck, and 2 times in the chest. The lethal wound was the stab on the left side of the neck. The deep wound caused by the perpetrator's strong thrust severed the main artery in the neck, resulting in excessive bleeding and death. Photos taken at the scene showed that the victim had bled profusely. The killer had stabbed him 9 times viciously, as if harboring deep hatred and intent on annihilating him. The day after the incident, the South Korean police received an anonymous tip that Patterson was the perpetrator of the Itaewon murder the previous night. Consequently, Patterson was promptly arrested by the police. Following several investigations, Patterson's friends described him as a person who enjoyed violence, was aggressive, impulsive, and often carried weapons. The police searched his house and found the knife used in the crime along with the clothes he wore that night, which had not been disposed of. The truth behind the case is a complex and dramatic story that I will continue to explain in more detail in the following parts of the podcast. Keep listening to learn more about the notable developments and trials related to the Itaewon murder case. Thank you for listening. Patterson admitted that the knife indeed belonged to him and that he was present in the restroom that night, but he did not admit to the murder. On April 6, 1997, Korean media widely reported on the case. Edward Lee's father, a U.S. serviceman stationed in South Korea, incidentally saw the news and discovered that his son was also in the restroom that night. He immediately returned to South Korea and urged his son to turn himself in, believing that something must have happened. Subsequently, Edward followed his father's advice and went to the Korean police station to surrender. At that time, the Korean police detained both suspects who were present at the scene that night. But this was just the beginning, revealing the weaknesses of the Korean police. Both suspects, although residing in South Korea, were American and not fluent in Korean. Notably, Edward requested an interpreter, but for some reasons, the Korean police denied his request. As a result, their communication was not very smooth. However, this was not a major issue. Soon after, the Korean police encountered deceit from both individuals. The 2 suspects, Patterson and Edward, provided completely contradictory confessions, each identifying the other as the real perpetrator. We all know there were no cameras in the restroom. In that room, besides the victim, there were only the 2 of them. There were no witnesses, so who was the actual killer? According to Edward's confession, Patterson told him, "Follow me into the restroom." Edward thought he needed to wash his hands after eating, so he agreed to follow. Upon entering the restroom, Edward saw a man inside. While washing his face, he saw Patterson suddenly pull out a knife and stab the man from behind. Edward was utterly terrified upon witnessing the scene. Patterson, on the other hand, identified Edward as the real perpetrator. Patterson recounted that Edward told him, "Come with me," I will show you something interesting." At that time, Patterson thought Edward would give him some ecstasy pills, so he followed. When they entered the restroom, he saw someone using the facilities. Thus, he wanted to wait outside for the person to leave before entering. However, unexpectedly, Edward suddenly walked in, grabbed Patterson's knife, and repeatedly stabbed the man. The man collapsed without any resistance. The whole process lasted less than 10 seconds. Seeing such a scene, Patterson was very frightened and ran away. When both of them consecutively turned themselves in to the police, Edward consistently claimed that he only went to wash his hands and did not expect such events to unfold. When the police asked him detailed questions, such as, "How did you see Patterson stab the other guy, and how many times?" Edward replied that he was so terrified at the time that he did not clearly remember the details. However, when Patterson confessed, he could describe the scene very precisely and recount the entire murder process clearly. Compared to the series of investigations, the Korean police believed Patterson was more likely the prime suspect, primarily based on the following reasons. 1. The knife belonged to Patterson. 2. Patterson attempted to destroy the evidence. 3. Patterson's body was covered in the victim's blood because the victim's neck artery was punctured. The blood pressure would cause a large amount of blood to splatter on the perpetrator. Edward also had blood on him, but significantly less than Patterson. This at least suggests that Patterson was closer to the victim. 4. Gang tattoo. Patterson had a Nort 14 tattoo, which is a symbol of a gang generation in California, USA. Therefore, the Korean police believed that Patterson seemed more like a killer. However, when the Korean police submitted the investigation results to the Korean prosecutor's office to prepare the indictment against Patterson, the prosecutor's office did not agree with the police's inference. Instead, they believed that Edward was the actual perpetrator. The reason the prosecutor's office believed this was mainly because the two suspects were separately tested 10 times, and the results were consistently the same. The results indicated that Edward was lying and Patterson was telling the truth. These results could only be used as references, not as evidence, because the suspects could have been trained to pass the test. Nonetheless, the prosecutor's office accepted the results of the lie detector test. Secondly, there's the height of the perpetrator. According to the autopsy report, the wound on the victim's neck was stabbed from behind at an angle. From this, it can be determined that the perpetrator must be taller and stronger than the victim. The victim was 1.76 meters tall, Patterson was 1.73 meters tall and weighed 75 kilograms. On the other hand, Edward was 180 meters tall and weighed 105 kilograms. Therefore, the prosecutor firmly believed that Edward was the real culprit. In May 1997, national prosecutors officially charged Edward with murder. The court found Edward guilty in the first trial, but he refused to accept the verdict and filed an appeal. In January 1998, the court in Seoul, South Korea, issued a preliminary ruling. They still found Edward guilty of murder and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Meanwhile, Patterson was convicted of concealing and destroying evidence and was sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in prison. However, nobody anticipated what happened afterward. Not long after, on August 15th, Korea's Liberation Day, which marks Korea's independence from Japanese rule in 1945. South Korea pardoned a group of prisoners, and Patterson was among them. Patterson was released after only serving a few months in prison. After Patterson was pardoned, public opinion in South Korea suddenly exploded. Although the court had ruled that Edward was the murderer, the evidence presented was still very vague and unconvincing. For instance, the court argued that Edward was tall and strong, matching the wound that was inflicted from a downward angle. However, skeptics noted that even though Patterson was 3 cm shorter than the victim, when a person uses the bathroom, their legs are usually spread and their back is bent down. In that situation, the victim would be a few centimeters shorter than their actual height. It was entirely possible that Patterson inflicted that wound. Additionally, Edward consistently denied the allegations and insisted that Patterson was the murderer. He believed he was wrongfully accused and continually sought to appeal. Therefore, Patterson, who was pardoned, could very well be the real culprit. How could they release him so easily? Under the pressure of public opinion, South Korean prosecutors filed to temporarily restrict Patterson from leaving the country and to prosecute him for murder if more evidence emerged in the future. At that time, the travel restriction order was only effective for 3 months, meaning it had to be renewed every 3 months. However, for some unknown reason, on August 23, 1999, at the expiration of the 3-month period, the prosecutor forgot to file the application for the travel restriction. By law, if the application is filed late, it would take 2 days to complete the reapplication procedures. This meant that the travel restriction order would take effect again on August 25, 1999. Patterson seemed to have known this and took advantage of those 2 days to successfully leave South Korea and return to the United States on August 24. Surprisingly, in September 1999, 1 month after Patterson fled back to the United States, Edward finally successfully appealed and was acquitted and released due to insufficient evidence from the prosecution. At that time, the case had happened just over 2 years prior, and of the 2 suspects, one had escaped back to the United States, while the other was ultimately acquitted due to the incompetence of the South Korean police and prosecutors. This incident caused great pain for the family of the victim, Jo Jung-pil. The entire South Korean society was enraged but could do nothing about it. On September 10, 1999, 12 years had passed since the incident occurred. A film titled The Itaewon Murder Case was released in South Korea. After the movie premiered, public opinion in South Korea flared up about the case. More and more people became aware of the story that happened 12 years ago. Everyone condemned the South Korean police and prosecutors for being incompetent and irresponsible. Under public pressure, in November 2009, 2 months after the film's release, South Korean police requested the extradition of Patterson to the U.S. authorities. Typically, the statute of limitations for criminal prosecutions in South Korea is 15 years. By that time, 12 years had already passed since the incident, leaving only 3 years until the deadline. If the statute of limitations expired, according to South Korean law, even if Patterson was extradited to South Korea, they would have no way to prosecute him. However, Providence intervened, and in June 2011, Patterson committed a crime in the US and was arrested by the police. At that time, only 6 months were left until the 15-year statute of limitations expired. Suddenly, a key witness emerged. He was a mutual friend of Edward and Patterson. He revealed that he had once sat with Patterson at a bar in Los Angeles in 2007. At that time, Patterson told him that he had indeed killed Jo Jung Pil and that the South Korean police couldn't do anything about it. Therefore, in December 2011, the Los Angeles court deemed the evidence of Patterson's involvement in the murder sufficient and decided to extradite him to South Korea for trial. At that time, South Korean law had paused the 15-year prosecution period until Patterson could be brought in for trial. Meanwhile, Patterson continued to deny the charges and insisted that he was not the murderer in the United States. On September 23, 2015, Patterson was finally extradited to South Korea. Facing the media at the airport, Patterson steadfastly claimed his innocence. He maintained that Edward was the real culprit. On January 25, 2017, the South Korean court publicly tried Patterson and delivered a verdict. At the time of the crime, Patterson was not yet 18 years old. Consequently, the court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, the maximum penalty for a juvenile under South Korean law. In March 2017, the victim's family pursued a negligence claim against the prosecutors and demanded compensation from the state. They ultimately received 360 million won in compensation. As for the suspect Edward, he is currently living in South Korea and has started his own family. The entire case, spanning over 20 years, has finally reached its conclusion. Patterson, despite being imprisoned, continues to deny his guilt to this day. Edward was declared innocent in the final trial, and the South Korean police cannot reopen the investigation.